The wind clawed at the cellar door, a banshee wail that rattled the timbers and sifted red dust through the cracks. Inside, Sarah huddled deeper into the damp earth, her arms wrapped tight around young Billy. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound that tore at Caleb's gut. He'd been tracking a stray heifer, lost to the storm, when he'd stumbled upon the root cellar. Now, the heifer was forgotten. The dust devil outside was nothing compared to the storm brewing in Sarah's eyes. "Take me," she'd pleaded, her voice raw and cracked, barely audible above the wind. "Take me as your concubine. I'll do whatever you want. Just save Billy." The words hung in the stale air, heavy and suffocating as the dust. Caleb stared at her, his face a mask carved from sun-baked leather. He'd seen hardship aplenty in his 30 years riding the unforgiving plains, but the sheer desperation etched on Sarah's face was something new. Billy clung to his mother, his eyes wide and unblinking. He couldn't have been more than 5, a wisp of a boy with dust-caked hair and ribs showing through his thin shirt. Caleb knelt, his spurs digging into the dirt floor. He reached out, his hand calloused and rough, and gently touched Billy's cheek. The boy flinched, but didn't pull away. "How long you been down here?" Caleb asked, his voice a low rumble. Sarah's shoulders slumped. 3 days, since they took Thomas. Took him where?" She swallowed hard, her gaze dropping to the dirt floor. "To redemption. For debt. He owed Cassidy. They said they'd sell everything. The farm, the animals. Us. Redemption. Cassidy. The name was enough to curdle milk. A man known for his ruthlessness, his grip on the land tighter than a hangman's noose. Caleb knew him. Everyone did. He stood, his tall frame filling the small space. The wind howled louder, as if mocking their predicament. He looked at Sarah, at the fear and despair etched on her face. He looked at Billy, clinging to his mother like a lifeline. "We're getting out of here," he said, his voice firm. "Now!" He reached for the cellar door, bracing himself against the wind. Storm ain't gonna last forever, and neither is Cassidy. He paused, his hand on the latch. Nobody sells a mother and her boy. The cellar door groaned open, spitting dust and grit into the already stifling air. Caleb shielded Billy's eyes as he emerged, then turned back to help Sarah. The wind tugged at her threadbare shawl, a constant reminder of their vulnerability. He ushered them towards his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Paint. He lifted Billy onto the saddle, then helped Sarah climb up behind him. "Hold tight," he murmured, his voice barely audible above the wind's howl. He swung up in front of them, his rifle secured in its scabbard. Paint, used to sudden departures, stood steady. The ride to Caleb's ranch was a blur of red earth and scrub brush. The storm had passed, leaving a sky washed clean and a landscape shimmering with an almost unbearable beauty. But Sarah saw none of it. Her gaze was fixed on Caleb's broad back, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and gratitude. His ranch was a collection of weathered buildings nestled in a small canyon, shielded from the worst of the wind. A few head of cattle grazed lazily in the distance, their silhouettes stark against the setting sun. It wasn't much, but it was his. And for now, it was sanctuary. He dismounted and helped Sarah and Billy down. He led them to the main cabin, its walls built of rough-hewn logs. Inside, the air was cool and dim, smelling of wood smoke and dust. A single window offered a view of the canyon, a framed picture of the harsh, unforgiving landscape. He busied himself, lighting a fire in the hearth, the flames licking hungrily at the dry wood. He glanced at Sarah, noticing the way she flinched at the sudden crackle. He knew what it was like to be startled by sudden noises, to live with a constant knot of tension in your gut. He remembered another fire, another time, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams. He pushed the memories back, burying them deep. That life was behind him now, or so he hoped. He'd been a different man then, a young gun with nothing to lose and everything to prove. He'd ridden with a hard crowd, men who lived and died by the gun. He'd seen things, done things that haunted his dreams. He'd left that life behind after a particularly bloody raid, sickened by the violence and the senseless loss of life. He'd wandered for months, searching for a way to atone, finally settling on this patch of land, hoping to find some measure of peace. He looked at Billy, huddled close to his mother, his eyes wide and fearful. He saw in the boy a reflection of his own lost innocence. Protecting them wasn't about lust or some misplaced sense of chivalry. It was about redemption. It was about trying to right the wrongs of his past, one small act of kindness at a time. It was about offering them a chance at a life he'd almost destroyed for himself. The cabin offered shelter, but not solace. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the changing angle of the sun through the single window and the relentless wind that never truly ceased its mournful song. Sarah moved through the routines of ranch life like a ghost, her movements hesitant, her eyes perpetually scanning the horizon. She cooked, cleaned, and tended to Billy, but her spirit remained trapped in that root cellar, choked by the dust of fear. Caleb watched her, his silence a constant presence. He saw the way she flinched when he raised his voice, even in greeting. He saw the shadows that danced in her eyes when Billy laughed too loud, too suddenly. He knew the brand that Thomas and men like him left on a woman's soul, a brand that festered long after the whip was put away. He'd catch her staring out at the open range, her face etched with a longing he couldn't quite decipher. Was it a yearning for escape, or a desperate hope that Thomas would somehow return? He suspected it was neither. It was the vast emptiness itself that terrified her, the endless horizon, a mirror reflecting the hollowness she felt inside. One evening, he found her sitting on the porch, the setting sun painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple. Billy was asleep inside, his small body curled up on a makeshift bed of blankets. Sarah was mending a tear in his shirt, her fingers moving with a practiced, almost mechanical grace. Caleb sat down beside her, his presence as quiet and unobtrusive as the shadows lengthening across the yard. He didn't speak, didn't offer any platitudes or empty words of comfort. He simply sat, sharing the silence. After a long while, Sarah spoke, her voice barely a whisper. He used to say I was lucky to have him, that no other man would want me." Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with a quiet intensity. "He was wrong," he said, his voice low and steady. "Dead wrong." He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The truth hung in the air between them, heavy and undeniable. He rose, his tall frame silhouetted against the dying light. "Get some rest, Sarah," he said. "Tomorrow's another day." He turned and walked towards the barn, leaving her alone with her ghosts. He knew she wouldn't sleep. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, the knowledge that someone saw her, that someone knew the weight she carried would lighten her burden, even if only for a moment. The land was harsh, unforgiving, but even in the most barren landscapes, a single wildflower could bloom, a testament to the enduring power of hope, and Caleb, in his own quiet way, was determined to nurture that fragile bloom within Sarah. The quiet didn't last. Word, like dust devils on the plains, traveled fast. It wasn't a week before Caleb saw the riders on the horizon, a dark smudge against the pale sky. Jedediah Cassidy hadn't taken kindly to losing what he considered his property. Sarah saw them too. He watched her from the window, her knuckles white as she gripped the frame. Billy, oblivious, played with a chipped wooden horse near the hearth. Caleb knew what was coming. He'd seen that look in men's eyes before. The cold, possessive rage of a man denied what he believed was his due. He walked outside, the dry earth crunching beneath his boots. He leaned against the porch railing, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the approaching riders. 3 of them, hard-looking men with rifles slung across their saddles. He recognized 2 of them from Redemption, men who'd likely seen their share of bloodshed. He'd hoped to avoid this. He'd hoped Cassidy would just write Sarah off as a loss. Move on to the next unfortunate soul caught in his web of debt. But Cassidy wasn't a man to let go of anything he considered his. Caleb had tried to leave that life behind, the life of guns and violence. He'd tried to build something new, something peaceful, on this barren patch of land. But the past had a way of catching up, like a shadow that refused to be shaken. He glanced back at the cabin, at Sarah and Billy inside. They were his responsibility now. He'd given his word, silent though it was, that he'd protect them, and he intended to keep it. Even if it meant drawing his gun again, the riders reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, kicking up a cloud of red dust. The lead rider, a burly man with a scarred face and a cold, dead look in his eyes, dismounted. "Where is she, rancher?" he growled, his voice rough as gravel. "Cassidy wants his property back." Caleb remained silent, his gaze unwavering. He knew that anything he said would only escalate the situation. He had to choose his next words, his next move, carefully. The riders spat on the ground. "Don't play coy with me. We know she's here. Hand her over, and we'll be on our way. No need for any trouble." Trouble was already here. It was etched on the faces of the men before him. It was in the set of their shoulders, the way they held their rifles. It was in the very air, thick with the threat of violence. And Caleb knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't avoid it any longer. He could only try to control it, to minimize the damage, to protect the woman and child who had sought refuge in his silent world. Caleb didn't flinch. He pushed himself off the porch railing, his movements slow, deliberate. "She's not property," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried on the wind. "She's a woman." The lead rider chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Sentimental, are we? Cassidy ain't going to care about your bleeding heart. He wants what's his." He gestured to his companions. "Go fetch her." Caleb didn't wait. He moved with a speed that belied his size, drawing his Colt Peacemaker in a single fluid motion. The shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. The lead rider staggered back, clutching his arm, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. "I said, she's not property," Caleb repeated, his voice cold and hard. "You want her? You'll have to come through me." The other 2 riders hesitated, their bravado momentarily shaken. They exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Caleb knew he had a slim advantage, a moment of surprise he had to exploit. "Get off my land," he said. his gun unwavering. Now! They didn't need a second invitation. They helped their wounded companion onto his horse, then spurred their mounts into a gallop, disappearing in a cloud of dust. Caleb watched them go, his jaw tight. He knew they'd be back. Cassidy wouldn't let this go. He holstered his gun, his mind already racing, calculating the odds, assessing his resources. He had to prepare, to fortify the ranch. He had to teach Sarah to defend herself. He turned and walked back to the cabin. Sarah stood in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. Billy clung to her leg, whimpering. "It's all right," Caleb said, his voice softer now. "They're gone." He knew it was a lie, a temporary reprieve, but he needed to give them something, some semblance of hope. He spent the next few hours boarding up the windows, reinforcing the door. He showed Sarah where he kept his spare rifle, a Winchester model 1873. He explained how to load it, how to aim, how to fire. She listened intently, her hands trembling as she held the weapon. "I can't," she said, her voice barely audible. "I've never shot a gun before." "You can," Caleb said, his voice firm. "You have to. It's the only way to protect yourself, to protect Billy." He took her out to the barn, set up a target against the far wall. He showed her how to stand, how to grip the rifle, how to squeeze the trigger. He spoke calmly, patiently, his voice a steady anchor in the storm of her fear. She fired, the rifle bucking in her hands. The bullet went wide, burying itself in the dirt. She flinched, her face contorted with frustration. "Again," Caleb said. They practiced for hours, until her shoulder ached and her hands were raw. Slowly, gradually, she began to improve. Her shots became more accurate, her movements more confident. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, Caleb stopped her. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You're doing good," he said. "You're stronger than you think." She met his gaze, her eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I have to be," she said, "for Billy." That night, the cabin felt smaller, more vulnerable. The silence was heavier, pregnant with unspoken fears. Sarah lay awake, listening to the wind howling outside, imagining the night wind and the imagined hoofbeats of approaching riders. Billy slept soundly beside her, oblivious to the danger that surrounded them. She clutched the rifle close, her knuckles white, her heart pounding in her chest. Caleb sat on the porch, his rifle across his lap, his gaze fixed on the darkness. He knew they wouldn't come tonight. They'd regroup, lick their wounds, plan their next move. But they would come. He was sure of it. He thought about his past, the life he'd tried so hard to escape. He'd seen too much violence, too much death. He'd wanted to find peace, to build a new life, far away from the darkness that had consumed him for so long. But the darkness always seemed to find him, like a shadow that refused to be left behind. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind. He thought about Sarah, about Billy. He thought about the promise he'd made, the unspoken vow to protect them. He wouldn't let them down. He'd fight to the death if he had to. The dawn broke cold and gray, painting the sky in shades of steel and lead. Caleb was already up, tending to the horses. He knew he had to move them to a more secure location, a hidden canyon a few miles from the ranch. He couldn't risk them being caught in the crossfire. He was leading the horses out of the barn when he heard the sound of approaching riders. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. "Sarah!" he yelled, his voice sharp and urgent. "Take Billy and get inside." He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He grabbed his rifle and ran towards the front of the cabin, taking cover behind a pile of firewood. The riders emerged from the trees, their faces grim, their rifles raised. There were 5 of them this time, including the wounded man from yesterday, his arm bandaged and slung across his chest. "All right, rancher," the lead rider yelled, his voice filled with hate. "We're here to finish what we started." Caleb didn't respond. He raised his rifle and fired. The shot found its mark, hitting one of the riders in the chest. The man screamed and fell from his horse, his body twisting in the dirt. The remaining riders opened fire, bullets ripping through the air, tearing splinters from the cabin walls. Caleb returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. He dropped another rider, leaving 3. He knew he couldn't hold them off forever. He was outnumbered, outgunned. He had to buy Sarah and Billy time to escape. Suddenly, he heard a whinny of pain. He glanced towards the barn and saw one of the horses fall to the ground, a bullet lodged in its flank. The horse thrashed wildly, its eyes filled with terror. Caleb felt a surge of anger. He loved those horses. They were his companions, his partners. He wouldn't let them be killed. He charged out from behind the woodpile, firing his rifle as he ran. He took down another rider, leaving only 2. But as he moved, he felt a searing pain in his leg. He stumbled and fell, his rifle skidding across the ground. The 2 remaining riders dismounted and advanced towards him, their faces contorted with rage. He was trapped, defenseless. Then he heard a shot. One of the riders screamed and clutched his stomach, falling to the ground. Caleb looked up and saw Sarah standing in the doorway of the cabin, the Winchester rifle in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She had done it. She had found her courage. The remaining rider hesitated, caught between finishing off Caleb and the sudden threat from the woman he'd been sent to retrieve. He swiveled, leveling his rifle at Sarah. Before he could fire, Caleb, fueled by adrenaline, scrambled for his fallen colt. The rider, distracted, didn't see him move until it was too late. Caleb fired, the bullet finding its mark in the rider's shoulder. He howled, dropping his rifle, clutching the wound. Sarah, seeing her chance, worked the lever action, chambering another round. She didn't hesitate. The rider, panicked, turned to flee, but her shot rang out, hitting him square in the back. He crumpled to the ground, motionless. Silence descended, broken only by the wind whistling through the canyon and Billy's soft whimpers from inside the cabin. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. Caleb pushed himself up, ignoring the throbbing in his leg. Sarah stood, frozen, the rifle still clutched in her hands, her eyes wide and unfocused. The adrenaline was fading, leaving her trembling and pale. He limped towards her, taking the rifle from her trembling hands. Her fingers were cold, her grip weak. He leaned the Winchester against the doorframe and gently took her arm, guiding her back inside. Billy ran to her, burying his face in her skirt, sobbing. She knelt down and wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. Caleb watched them, a knot of emotion tightening in his chest. He knew this wasn't over. Cassidy would send more men, but for now, they were safe. For now, they had survived. He patched up his leg as best he could, using a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt. It was a flesh wound, nothing serious, but it would slow him down. Later, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Sarah emerged from the cabin. She carried a basin of water and a clean cloth. Caleb was sitting on the porch, cleaning his guns. She knelt beside him, her eyes downcast. "Let me," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, then nodded. He laid down his rifle and watched as she gently began to clean the wound on his leg. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her fingers light and careful. He winced as she dabbed at the wound with the damp cloth. "Sorry," she murmured, her cheeks flushed. "It's all right," he said, his voice gruff. She continued to clean the wound, her brow furrowed in concentration. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the sounds of the wind and the chirping of crickets. As she worked, her fingers brushed against his skin. He felt a strange warmth spread through him, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the lines of worry etched around her eyes, the weariness in her face, but he also saw a strength, a resilience that he hadn't noticed before. She looked up, meeting his gaze. For a moment, their eyes locked, and a flicker of something passed between them, a spark of understanding, a hint of connection. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She quickly looked away, her cheeks flushing even deeper. She finished cleaning the wound and wrapped it with a clean bandage. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. "You're welcome," she replied, her voice barely audible. She gathered the basin and cloth and stood up, turning to go back inside. "Sarah," he said, stopping her. She turned back to face him, her eyes questioning. "Be careful," he said, his voice rough around the edges. "They'll be back. Cassidy won't give up easy." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I know," she said. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect Billy." She went back inside, leaving Caleb alone on the porch. He watched the sunset, the fiery colors painting the sky in hues of orange and red. He knew he had to prepare for what was coming. He had to protect Sarah and Billy, even if it meant sacrificing everything. 3 days passed, filled with an uneasy quiet. Caleb spent his time fortifying the ranch, setting up defenses, and teaching Sarah how to shoot. She was a quick learner, her fear slowly being replaced by a steely resolve. Billy, sensing the tension, clung to her side, his eyes wide with apprehension. Then, on the 4th day, they came. It wasn't the same group of riders. This time it was a single man riding a black stallion, his face grim and determined. He was dressed in a fine suit, not the garb of a common ranch hand. He was Jedediah Cassidy himself. He stopped his horse a few yards from the porch, his eyes sweeping over the ranch. He saw the boarded-up windows, the makeshift barricades, the signs of a struggle. He saw Caleb sitting on the porch, his rifle across his lap, his face a mask of defiance. "Caleb," Cassidy said, his voice smooth and menacing, "I've come for what's mine." Caleb didn't flinch. He rose to his feet, his rifle held steady. "She's not yours," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "She's a free woman." Cassidy chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "Sentimental fool. You think you can stand against me? I own this town, this county, this whole damn territory. You're just a dirt farmer, Caleb. You can't protect her." "I can try," Caleb said, his voice unwavering. Cassidy's eyes narrowed. "All right, Caleb. I'll give you one chance. Hand over the woman, and I'll let you live. I'll even let you keep your ranch." Refuse, and I'll burn this place to the ground. I'll make sure you and everyone you care about suffer." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The choice is yours." The silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. Caleb stood his ground, his face impassive, his eyes locked on Cassidy's. He thought of Sarah, of Billy, of the life they were trying to build. He thought of the promise he'd made to protect them. "She's not going anywhere," Caleb said, his voice firm and resolute. "You want her? You'll have to come and get her." A flicker of anger crossed Cassidy's face. "So be it," he said, his voice cold and deadly. "You've made your choice." He spurred his horse, turning it around. "Consider this your last warning." He rode away, disappearing into the trees. Caleb watched him go, his jaw tight, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew Cassidy would be back, and this time he wouldn't be alone. The ultimatum had been delivered. The battle was coming. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, a stark contrast to the grim determination settling over the ranch. Caleb knew Cassidy wouldn't wait. The show of force, the thinly veiled threat, it was all a prelude. The real storm was brewing. He spent the last sliver of daylight reinforcing the cabin, piling more firewood against the walls, checking the meager ammunition. Sarah helped, her movements swift and purposeful, her earlier fear replaced by a quiet, almost unnerving calm. She checked the Winchester, her practiced hands moving with a newfound confidence. Billy huddled near the fireplace, clutching a worn-out toy horse, his eyes wide and watchful. As darkness consumed the land, an unnatural silence descended. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind died down. Even the coyotes seemed to hold their breath. It was the kind of silence that preceded a storm, a silence that made the hair on the back of Caleb's neck stand on end. Then it began, a distant flicker of light, followed by the faint crackle of flames. Caleb peered into the darkness, his eyes straining to see. The flames grew larger, brighter, licking at the edge of the trees, spreading rapidly. Cassidy wasn't just coming for Sarah. He was coming to destroy everything. "They're trying to flush us out," Caleb said, his voice low and grim. "He set the woods on fire." He grabbed his rifle and moved to the front door. Sarah followed, her own rifle in hand. Billy stayed by the fireplace, his small body trembling. Suddenly, a volley of gunfire erupted from the darkness. Bullets ripped through the air, slamming into the cabin walls, shattering windows. Caleb and Sarah returned fire, their shots precise and deadly, aimed at the flashes of gunfire in the darkness. The attack intensified. Men emerged from the trees, their faces hidden by bandanas, their rifles blazing. They charged towards the cabin, yelling and screaming, their intent clear. Caleb fought like a man possessed. He moved quickly and efficiently, his past training kicking in. He remembered the ambushes, the skirmishes, the brutal hand-to-hand combat. He knew how to use the darkness to his advantage, how to anticipate his enemy's moves. He was a ghost, a shadow, a deadly force to be reckoned with. Sarah fought beside him, her aim steady, her resolve unwavering. She had never fired a gun in anger before, but now she was fighting for her life, for her son's life. She was a mother, protecting her young, and her ferocity was a force to behold. The night sky was illuminated by the raging fire, casting long, dancing shadows across the battlefield. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and smoke. The sounds of gunfire, screams, and the crackling flames filled the night. It was a scene of chaos and destruction, a descent into hell. Then the dynamite went off. A deafening blast ripped through the night, throwing men and debris into the air. The front of the cabin shuddered, threatening to collapse. The blast knocked Caleb off his feet. He landed hard, his head slamming against the porch railing. Dazed, he struggled to rise, the ringing in his ears deafening. Through the haze, he saw them, 3 figures emerging from the smoke, their rifles leveled at him. He was trapped, exposed. He braced for the inevitable. Then, a figure darted from the cabin. Sarah, rifle blazing, charged towards the attackers, drawing their fire. Her sudden appearance startled them, throwing off their aim. Bullets whizzed past Caleb's head as he scrambled for his rifle. Sarah fought with a desperate courage, firing rapidly, forcing the men to take cover. But she was outnumbered, outgunned. One of the men managed to flank her, raising his rifle for a clear shot. Caleb, adrenaline surging, roared to his feet. He fired, hitting the man in the leg, sending him sprawling. But it was too late. The other man fired, the bullet striking Sarah in the shoulder. She cried out, stumbling backward, clutching her wound. Caleb lunged forward, shielding her with his body. The remaining attacker hesitated, momentarily stunned by Sarah's bravery and Caleb's fierce protectiveness. Caleb seized the opportunity. He fired, the bullet finding its mark in the man's chest. He crumpled to the ground, lifeless. Caleb knelt beside Sarah, his heart pounding in his chest. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with pain. Blood soaked her shirt, staining his hands. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Sarah, are you all right?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "Billy," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Is Billy safe?" "He's safe," Caleb assured her, his voice trembling. "I'll get you inside. You'll be all right." He carefully lifted her in his arms, ignoring the pain in his leg. He carried her back to the cabin, his every step filled with dread. He had promised to protect her, and now he had failed. He had brought this violence to her doorstep, and she was paying the price. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him reeling with guilt and a profound sense of helplessness. He was supposed to be the protector, the strong one, but in this moment, all he felt was broken. He laid her gently by the fireplace, Billy rushing to her side, his face streaked with tears. Caleb ripped a strip of cloth from his shirt, pressing it against Sarah's wound, trying to stem the bleeding. He needed to get her to a doctor, but the nearest town was days away, and the woods were crawling with Cassidy's men. "Stay with her, Billy," Caleb rasped, his voice strained. "Don't leave her side." He grabbed his rifle and staggered back outside, his gaze sweeping the burning landscape. The attack had subsided, but he knew it wasn't over. Cassidy wouldn't give up this easily. The man was like a rabid dog driven by greed and a thirst for control, and then he saw them. A group of riders emerged from the smoke-filled woods, led by Cassidy himself. They were dragging someone behind them, tied to a horse. Caleb's blood ran cold. It was Sarah. Rage, raw and primal, surged through him, obliterating the pain, the exhaustion, the fear. He had failed to protect her. He had let Cassidy take her. The guilt and self-reproach were unbearable, but beneath them burned a white-hot fury, a need for retribution that consumed him entirely. He raised his rifle, taking aim at Cassidy, but hesitated. He couldn't risk hitting Sarah. He needed to get closer to create an opportunity. He watched as Cassidy and his men rode towards the edge of the woods, disappearing into the darkness. They were heading towards town, towards Cassidy's stronghold. Caleb knew what he had to do. He turned back to the cabin, his face a mask of grim determination. He knelt beside Billy, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "Billy," he said, his voice low and serious, "I need you to be brave. I need you to stay here and protect your mother. Can you do that for me?" Billy nodded, his eyes wide with fear, but his jaw set with resolve. "I will," he said, his voice trembling. Caleb squeezed his shoulder, then turned and walked back into the night. He was wounded, exhausted, outnumbered, but he had nothing left to lose. He was driven by a single, all-consuming purpose: to rescue Sarah and make Cassidy pay. He moved like a shadow, using the darkness and the smoke to his advantage. He stalked Cassidy and his men, his senses heightened, his every muscle tense. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he didn't care. He was prepared to face whatever awaited him, to sacrifice everything for the woman he had come to care for. The fire crackled behind him, casting an orange glow on his determined face. He was a man pushed to the edge, a force of nature unleashed. He was coming for Cassidy, and hell was coming with him. The town of Redemption was a festering wound on the prairie, a collection of ramshackle buildings clinging to the promise of prosperity that never quite arrived. Saloons overflowed with the desperate and the dissolute, while the dust-choked streets whispered tales of broken dreams. It was here, in the heart of Cassidy's domain, that Caleb tracked them. He moved through the shadows, a wraith unnoticed amidst the revelry and despair. The saloons offered a glimpse, a flash of crimson hair, the glint of a rifle barrel, the unmistakable cruel laughter of Jedediah Cassidy. He found Sarah locked in a back room of the saloon, guarded by two of Cassidy's men. She was bruised and terrified, but alive. Caleb didn't hesitate. He moved with the speed and precision of a coiled snake, slipping through the back alley, silent as the desert wind. He took out the guards swiftly, efficiently. The violence, a necessary evil, a means to an end. He didn't relish it, but he wouldn't shy from it. He found Sarah, tied to a chair, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm here," he said, his voice low and reassuring. He quickly untied her, his hands gentle despite the urgency of the situation. "He's waiting for you," Sarah warned. "Cassidy. He knows you're coming." Caleb nodded. He knew this was never going to be easy. He led Sarah out of the saloon, back into the shadows. He needed to get her to safety, to put as much distance as possible between her and Cassidy. But he couldn't leave without dealing with the man who had terrorized her, who had threatened to take everything from her. He found Cassidy in the center of the saloon, surrounded by his men. He was holding a glass of whiskey, a smug smile on his face. "Well, well," he drawled, his eyes glinting with malice. "Look who decided to join the party." Caleb didn't say a word. He simply walked forward, his eyes fixed on Cassidy. The saloon fell silent, the air thick with tension. A showdown was coming, and everyone knew it. The fight was brutal, a whirlwind of fists and boots, of broken glass and shattered furniture. Caleb fought with a controlled fury, his movements precise and deadly. He took down Cassidy's men, one by one, each blow a testament to his determination. Finally, It was just Caleb and Cassidy, facing each other across the wreckage of the saloon. Cassidy was battered and bruised, his face a mask of rage. He lunged at Caleb, swinging a broken bottle, but Caleb dodged the blow and landed a crushing right hook. Cassidy went down, sprawling on the floor. Caleb stood over him, his chest heaving, his eyes filled with a cold resolve. He could kill him, end it all right here and now. He owed it to Sarah, to Billy, to everyone who had suffered at Cassidy's hands. But then he hesitated. He looked at Cassidy, lying defeated and broken, and he saw not a monster, but a man driven by greed and ambition, a man who had made terrible choices, but still a man. Caleb holstered his gun. He knelt down beside Cassidy, his voice low and hard. "This is over," he said. "You're done." He didn't kill him. He didn't need to. He had taken away his power, his control, his reputation. He had left him with nothing but the consequences of his actions. He left Cassidy lying in the dirt, a broken and humiliated man. He walked out of the saloon. He walked out of the saloon into the cool night air, Sarah waiting for him just outside. The town of redemption seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. He didn't look back. They rode back to the cabin in silence, the vast expanse of the prairie a stark reminder of their isolation. The fire had died down, leaving only embers glowing in the darkness. Billy ran to them, his small arms wrapping around Sarah's legs. "Mama, you're safe," he cried, his voice filled with relief. Sarah knelt down, hugging him tightly. "I'm safe, baby. I'm safe." Back in the cabin, the weight of the past few days settled upon them. Sarah sat by the fire, staring into the flames, her eyes haunted. The physical wounds would heal, but the emotional scars ran deep. Caleb watched her, his heart aching. He knew he couldn't erase what had happened, but he could be there for her, to help her find her way back to the light. He sat beside her, not touching, just offering his presence. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet heavy. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I keep seeing it," she said, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Cassidy, his men, the saloon." Caleb reached out, taking her hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. "It's over, Sarah," he said, his voice gentle. "It's over." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "Is it ever really over?" He didn't have an answer. He knew the memories would linger, that the fear would always be there, lurking in the shadows. But he also knew that Sarah was strong, that she had a resilience that would see her through. He stayed with her through the night, watching over her as she slept. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was ready to walk it with her. He would help her rebuild her life, brick by brick, memory by memory. He would be her shield against the darkness, her anchor in the storm. In the days that followed, Sarah struggled to find her footing. The simplest tasks felt monumental, the fear a constant companion. But slowly, with Caleb's quiet support and Billy's unwavering love, she began to heal. She started tending to the garden again, the earth beneath her fingers a source of comfort. She read to Billy in the evenings, her voice regaining its strength. She even started to smile again, a fragile, tentative smile that warmed Caleb's heart. The West could be a cruel place, he knew. But it could also be a place of second chances. Spring painted the prairie in hues Sarah hadn't thought she'd see again, a riot of wild flowers pushing through the scarred earth. The cabin, once a symbol of fear, now felt like a sanctuary, a testament to their shared survival. They stayed. The decision wasn't spoken, not in so many words. It was in the way Caleb helped her mend the fences, his calloused hands working alongside hers. It was in the way he watched Billy chase rabbits through the tall grass, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. It was in the quiet evenings, sharing a meager meal, the silence no longer heavy with dread, but filled with a budding understanding. They worked the land, side by side. Sarah, with her knowledge of herbs and healing, tended to the livestock. Caleb, with his strength and unwavering determination, coaxed life back from the parched soil. They weren't lovers, not yet. But they were partners, bound by a shared trauma and a growing respect. He taught her to shoot, the rifle, a heavy weight in her hands at first, but soon an extension of her will. She taught him the names of the wildflowers, the secrets whispered on the wind. Billy thrived. The nightmares lessened, replaced by the boisterous energy of a boy with a whole prairie to explore. He clung to Caleb, seeing in him a protector, a father figure he desperately craved. Caleb, gruff and reserved, didn't push him away. He showed Billy how to track animals, how to build a fire, how to respect the land. The boy's laughter echoed through the valley, a melody of hope against the vast silence. The landscape, once a symbol of isolation, began to feel like a home. The sunsets, fiery and defiant, painted the sky with promises of a new dawn. The wind, once a mournful cry, now whispered secrets of resilience and rebirth. One evening, after a long day of mending fences, they sat by the fire, the embers glowing like dying stars. Billy was asleep in his bed, his dreams untroubled for once. Sarah looked at Caleb, her heart overflowing with a gratitude she couldn't express. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Caleb looked at her, his eyes filled with a warmth she hadn't seen before. He didn't say anything, but his gaze spoke volumes. He had found a purpose in protecting her, in building a future with her. He had found a peace he never thought possible, a solace in the simple act of living, of loving, of healing. The West was still a harsh mistress, but in Sarah and Billy, he had found a reason to tame her, to carve out a life from the unforgiving land. And in him, Sarah saw not just a savior, but a partner, a friend, and perhaps, one day, something more. The embers glowed, mirroring the quiet hope that flickered in their hearts, a promise of a future forged in the ashes of the past. Years bled into each other, marked not by calendars, but by the changing seasons, the growth of Billy, and the slow, steady mending of Sarah's heart. The cabin, once a refuge from terror, became a home, filled with the comforting sounds of daily life, the clatter of pots, Billy's laughter, the soft murmur of Sarah's voice as she read aloud. Caleb, ever watchful, remained their silent guardian, his presence a constant reassurance. The ranch, once a desolate patch of land, flourished under their combined efforts. Sarah's garden bloomed with vibrant colors, attracting hummingbirds and butterflies. The livestock thrived, their numbers steadily increasing. Caleb, with his tireless work ethic, had transformed the land into a testament to their resilience. He rarely spoke of the past, but Sarah saw the ghosts receding from his eyes, replaced by a quiet contentment. Billy grew into a young man, strong and capable, with a mischievous glint in his eyes and a deep love for the land. He idolized Caleb, mimicking his stoic demeanor and his unwavering work ethic. He learned to ride, to hunt, to track, to survive in the harsh environment. He was a product of the West, but he was also a product of their love, their forgiveness, their unwavering belief in the power of hope. One sun-drenched afternoon, Caleb stood in the corral, a gentle mare, saddled and ready. Billy, now a head taller than Sarah, stood beside him, his eyes shining with anticipation. Sarah watched from the porch, a familiar ache in her heart, a mixture of pride and fear. "Ready, son?" Caleb asked, his voice gruff, but kind. Billy nodded, his face flushed with excitement. He swung himself onto the mare, his movements surprisingly graceful. Caleb steadied the reins, his calloused hands guiding Billy's. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Feel her. Let her know you're in charge." Billy took a deep breath, his hands tightening on the reins. He urged the mare forward, and she responded with a gentle trot. Caleb walked alongside them, offering quiet instructions, his eyes never leaving Billy's face. Sarah watched them circle the corral, the boy and the silent rancher, a tableau of hope and redemption against the backdrop of the vast prairie. The West remained unforgiving, a land of harsh realities and broken dreams. But here, in this small corner of the world, kindness and forgiveness had taken root, blossoming into a life filled with love, resilience, and the promise of a brighter future. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and gold, a silent benediction on their enduring spirit.